Hello everyone. There's been a really interesting dialogue going on YouTube lately about fairness in sports in general and how that applies to transgender women competing against non-transgender women in particular. I'm going to primarily be responding to a video by Rationality Rules because he's at the center of this latest controversy. I actually like a lot of things about Rationality Rules. I like how he seems to always try and be open-minded.
Now, if you think I'm wrong on this topic and have a better argument than those just covered, then please do let me know, as if I'm wrong, I want to know it.
As well as tolerant towards marginalized groups. I like how he started his video by suggesting we all drink tea.
Why hello my fellow apes. I hope that you're well and that you've got a big cup of tea at the ready.
I especially like his Marauders map mug. And I like how in his latest video he discusses the differences between men on the one hand and transgender women who have gone through hormone replacement therapy on the other hand.
I wholeheartedly accept and appreciate the intellectual criticisms.
Woodford utilised a basic bait and switch. He invited us to discuss the counter that trans women on HRT don't have an advantage due to said HRT. That was what he advertised. He then went on to assert that many of said traits remain in spite of HRT. That's when the switch took place. Instead of referencing articles on the differences between cis women and trans women who have undergone HRT, Woodford goes on to roll out articles discussing the differences between cis women and cis men.
Now this was, in my opinion, my biggest intellectual blunder. I equivocated trans women with non-trans men, and that's a huge mistake that could have been fixed with just a paragraph or two. Another of my intellectual mistakes refers to hemoglobin.
Well, this is awkward. You see, this is what happens when you attempt a bait and switch, using studies comparing cis women to cis men, rather than cis women to trans women on HRT. You end up talking a load of pure bollocks about hemoglobin being the greatest source of trans woman advantage, only to then discover that hemoglobin counts of trans women are the same as those of cis women.
Indeed, my views on hemoglobin were mistaken.
However, I don't agree with everything he says, so that's what this video is going to be about. When it comes to unfair advantage, I think there needs to be two different standards. The first standard should apply to advantages that a person has naturally. The other standard should apply to advantages that somebody has due to medical interventions. We'll go over that standard in more detail later. The problem I have with Rationality Rules video is that he doesn't seem to make a distinction between these two standards, and I think he misapplies the standard to trans women. Some might argue that any advantage an athlete has naturally can't be considered an unfair advantage. I think that's intuitive at first, but ultimately I don't think it can be true. For example, I think most of the difference between the athletic ability of an 8-year-old and a 20-year-old are due to biological, natural advantages. Yet it's not fair for an 8-year-old to compete against a 20-year-old. So the standard for natural advantages can't be that any advantage is fine as long as it's natural. However, I also think it's clear that some natural advantage is permissible.
Because we allow advantages in sport. I'm going to be talking to Martina Navratilova, and for instance, we let left-handed players compete against right-handed players, and left-handed players have advantages in many sports, including tennis. We don't, however, allow heavyweight boxers to get into the ring with flyweight boxers. So the question isn't, are there advantages? The question is, can two groups, population groups, compete against one another in meaningful sport? And if they can, they should be in the same category. And if they can't, they shouldn't. And so if we go back to the heavyweight boxer thing, putting a big boxer into a ring with a little boxer, that's not meaningful sport. It doesn't tell us anything interesting about the the relative abilities of the two boxers, the big boxer wins every time. But left-handed athletes and right-handed athletes can engage in meaningful sport.
When it comes to medical advantage, I think the YouTuber Noel Plum does the best job of explaining what this is and why it should be that way.
WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, is responsible for curating a list of proscribed substances. These are substances that you either cannot take at all, either because they are performance enhancing or because they mask performance enhancing drugs. But there are situations where those substances can be used if there is deemed to be a legitimate medical need, what is called a therapeutic use, in which case you can apply for what is called a therapeutic use exemption. The principle with TUEs, folks, is always the same. It is legitimate to have a TUE as long as you have a legitimate need for it, and as long as taking that substance at the level in which you are allowed to take it takes your performance only up to the level you would have been without the condition being prevalent within your body to begin with, that substance is managing, but never above it.
Notice how this standard differs from the natural ability standard. Let's imagine that a woman has a gene that makes her 1 inch taller than the average woman. We don't say that, oh, if she didn't have that gene, she wouldn't perform as well, therefore it's an unfair advantage. Imagine there's a left-handed gene. We wouldn't say that a left-handed tennis player, because they have that gene that makes them left-handed, it has an unfair advantage over a right-handed competitor, even though it is in fact true that they would have an advantage. It's not unfair because they can still engage in what Joanna Harper calls meaningful sport. Let's start with transgender men competing in men's sports, and then we'll move on to transgender women. Many transgender men, like me, take testosterone as part of our transition. Obviously, testosterone is a banned substance, so they can't be judged by the natural ability standard. Instead, I think they should be judged on the medical intervention standard. So there would be 2 criteria that a trans man would have to meet for it to be considered fair under the medical standard. First, there would need to be a legitimate medical need. I'm going to assume that since Rationality Rules and I both think that transgender women are women and transgender men are men.
Let me make something as clear as I possibly can. While I very much believed, and still believe, that there's a discussion to be had about the fairness of allowing women who have experienced male puberty to compete against women who haven't, Laurel is a woman. Period.
That transition-related medical interventions are necessary. So they meet the first standard. What about the second? The second criteria is that taking the substance takes your performance only up to the level you would have been at had you not had the condition the intervention is meant to treat. For this criteria, I'd like to compare trans men taking testosterone for transition reasons to a case summarized by Noel Plum in his video.
I want to remind you of the case of Oscar Pistorius. I'm sure many of you remember him. Many of you will remember that he was called the Blade Runner. He is this South African chap whose legs terminate just below his knees, and he ran on these carbon fibre blades. But what many of you may not know about Oscar Pistorius is that Oscar Pistorius wished to race not in the Paralympics, but alongside the able-bodied athletes. Nobody was claiming that the issue was these blades offered him an advantage over not wearing them. Clearly he could perambulate around the 400-metre track faster with those blades on than if he was just running on his stumps, right? Nobody was suggesting that that was the metric to go by. What they meant by an advantage is effectively, if you imagine Oscar Pistorius had an identical monozygotic twin brother, would he be running with the same amount of training and diet, etc.? Would Oscar Pistorius on these blades be running faster than his identical twin brother who had a normal set of legs? That was the key.
Just like nobody said it was unfair for the runner to run on his blades because he would run faster on his blades than he would on his stumps. Similarly, I don't think trans men should be considered to have an advantage over cis men because they run faster than they would have without hormone therapy. Just like the runner's blades are meant to replace legs, the hormone replacement therapy for trans men is meant to replace testes. So what the standard needs to be for trans men is they can't perform any better than they would have performed if they had been born with testicles. Noel concludes in his video that after reviewing the science, he doesn't believe that trans men have an advantage over cis men. So what about trans women? What should the standard be for them? Well, I think it's clear that they should be judged on the natural advantage standard. After all, any advantage that they have isn't due to their hormone replacement therapy. Their hormone replacement therapy reduces their advantage. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's fair for them to compete. After all, 15-year-olds have an advantage over 8-year-olds that's completely natural, but it's unfair for them to compete against each other. When it comes to trans women who haven't been on hormone replacement therapy, I think they are analogous to the 15-year-old competing against the 8-year-old. But when they are on hormone therapy, there's much less of a difference. So in those cases, I think it's much more analogous to a left-handed athlete competing against a right-handed athlete.
Really interesting, this. The pivotal question is this: can reassigned transsexuals compete fairly with others of their new sex? Our data are limited and do not provide insight into all pertinent aspects. In real life, this is interesting, there will always be an element of arbitrariness in the drawing of competitive lines. Different individuals are born with and develop postnatally different potentials. The caprices of genetics and postnatal development will make any form of competition intrinsically unfair at some level. The implication is that all men and women are not born equally endowed for competition in sports. But hey, sport's kind of arbitrary and everybody's different to one another anyway, so dependent upon what degree of arbitrariness you're willing to accept, yeah, we think it probably is fair. How you draw that conclusion, I do not know.
Anyways, that's all I've got for now. What do you all think? Am I right about the two different standards? Are there more? Are there fewer? Did I apply them correctly to trans athletes?